Joe, aside from having to talk to me and other media elites today, how's your day going?
It's very good, actually. No complaints. You know, I've been. It's this year is my 30th anniversary of Brothers Keeper, which was my first true crime film, and I, people continue to want to talk to me about and allowing me to make these films. So how can I be anything but happy that I've spent most of my adulthood doing what I love, which is telling stories and hopefully moving people.
Now, before I ask you about conversations with the killer, one question for you. Does your lifestyle determine your death style?
Very good, and let me turn it around. Who came up with that lyric? And then I'll be really impressed.
Oh, Mr. James Hetfield.
No, no, no. It was Kirk Hammett. That was his contribution.
I remember the following scene with the wash my back so I stab yours. That lyric also, whatever that was. But the key is,
I
I've
thought
been
that
watching.
Kirk in that movie, Kirk, as you see, they took away his riffs. They didn't, one of the greatest guitarists of all time wasn't allowed to do riffs. Uh, Previously, James and Lars had a total lock on lyrics and songwriting, and so
Right.
this was one of Kirk's first contributions, and I thought it was a great line because it truly, I think it is a great thought that truly captures the dilemma of being a rock and roller, and what they were going through. It's like they had lived this sex, drugs, and rock and roll ethos, and in fact, the whole image of metal is connected to that ethos. And they had gotten to the point where they had families and were getting older and wanted to make music, but they didn't want to do all the drug and drinking and maybe some of the sex. But they I can't speak to that. But it is a classic. It is a classic line that captured kind of what they were going through. So it's funny. It's funny you mentioned that line because it's one of my favorite lyrics and moments from Some Kind of Monster.
It gets said by a lot of musician friends of mine on a regular basis. So if that has to go on your tombstone, so be it that you
Oh,
put that
cool.
into the world.
I
But
love it.
conversations with a killer, I would have to assume there's a lot of FOIL requests going on. Are you yourself filing any of those FOIL requests?
I mean, honestly, I'm lucky enough to be at the stage of my career that I have people doing that for me, which is wonderful. Catherine Park was the showrunner, and Ted Schillinger was the co-executive producer. We had an amazing team of people who worked on the show, so we did file, but I don't personally do it.
Had you had to do that earlier on with your projects?
Oh yeah, it's interesting. Who dreamed documentaries would become so popular? I mean, there was a time in my career where when Bruce, particularly when Bruce Sinofsky, God bless him, who
Yeah.
passed away in 2015, when Bruce and I, started off in this business. When we did Brothers Keeper, all we did was Brothers Keeper for 2 years. We produced, directed, edited, drove the truck, bought the film, brought it to the lab because it was shot on film in those days. Um, you know, all we did was one thing at a time and wore 20 hats, and honestly did lots of TV commercials to pay the bills because documentaries weren't very profitable back then. Now it's an incredibly robust business. It's extremely popular. Who would have guessed? Again, I think I said Brothers Keeper turns 30 this year, so I really have a 30-year perspective on the business. I
Hmm.
never dreamed when I first started, when we did Brothers Keeper, if you didn't sell your documentary back then to HBO or PBS, you weren't making a documentary because those were the only two outlets. There was no such thing there's a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, there was no such thing as docu series.
Hmm.
And I remember when we self-distributed Brothers Keeper in the movie theater, if 400 people saw the movie in a weekend, we'd high five each other like, oh my God, we died and went to heaven. 400 people saw our movie.
Right.
Now, this show that we're talking about, or my other stuff on Netflix, and I'm not trying to brag, I'm just trying to say it's just a very different world. This thing goes out and hundreds of millions of people see it around the world instantaneously. It's incredible. It's like, who would have guessed? So these days, luckily, I'm able to, juggle a few projects simultaneously, and I have a great staff that does some of the things I used to do myself.
Well, your projects are rooted in nonfiction, but you could say it's horror adjacent in that there's dark themes to it. There's bad things that kind of happen, and it's not far off from the metal world, the horror world, etc. Something I like to find out from people who find success in the darker themes is when exactly did this become a career as opposed to I like dark stuff and this is a hobby?
Well, it's funny, I seem to have become that person you describe, but I've always thought of myself as a social justice documentarian. I mean, look, Brothers Keeper and Paradise Lost, which are considered the granddaddies of, along with Errol Morris's Thin Blue Line, of course. But, those three films are considered the granddaddies of the true crime wave that we find ourselves in.
Sure.
And those were purely social justice experiences. Paradise Lost is a story of wrongful conviction, but it touched upon witchcraft, which, you know, didn't exist in the way that the police claim. It wasn't a satanic ritual murder. But I was coming at it from more of a social justice standpoint. But I will say, I am just endlessly fascinated by what makes people do bad things. In the case of Paradise Lost, the bad things were being done by the prosecution. Like, how do those guys go to bed at night knowing that they're putting the wrong people in prison? The bad things weren't you know, the the, the alleged teen Satanists who I thought were just, one cocky teenager, one shy teenager who had nothing to do with, devil worshipping murders. But I'm fascinated by why people do what they do, and it's the reason to do a Conversations with a Killer, even in 2022. Even though Gacy has been done before, I wanted to look at it through a social justice lens, because if you step back and look at this dark story through a social justice lens, that's the story I'm telling here, which is how prejudice against the gay community allowed this guy to flourish for years. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Robert Peace was the last victim, and we start with the last victim in Conversations with a Killer. Um, you know, but for 4 or 5 years, there were 32 other disappearances that didn't even register a blip in the police department's minds, and that's having to do a lot with prevailing attitudes towards the gay community. People were afraid to report the crimes because they wouldn't be taken seriously. If they did report the crimes, they were fearful that, you know, prejudice would actually get them in hot water. I mean, it was an era where homosexuality was still discussed as a sickness.
Yeah.
And so to see it through that lens, not just, I've always made a point in all of my true crime reporting and all of my examinations of the dark side, it's very important to, always remember that there's a victim there, and to
Mm-hmm.
have a reason to tell the story. In other words, I don't want to just wallow in the misery of others because it's a good story. There needs to be a social justice component to it. And in this case, understanding how this guy could have gotten away with it for so long because of prevailing attitudes towards the gay community. The other reason to tell the story, both Bundy and Gacy,
Mm-hmm.
when I first started doing Bundy, and of course Gacy is a continuation of the Bundy series, but when I was debating when these tapes first came to me and I was debating whether to do Bundy, because I thought to myself, well, these tapes are good, but Bundy has been told many times before, can I bring something new to it? And I turned to my two college age daughters who were sitting at the kitchen table with me, because it was over a holiday. And I said, do you know who Ted Bundy was? And both of my daughters are extremely bright, top of their class, went to great schools, like I know I'm sounding like a proud dad, but very intelligent young women. Uh,
Sure.
and they had no idea who Bundy was. And I said, well, ask your friends, right now, go text, see if you, and most, and a couple, oh, wasn't he a serial killer? But for the most part, that 22 to 25-year-old generation, or 24-year-old, that's how old my older daughter was, because she was actually in grad school at the time. But nobody really had a take on who Bundy was. And so for me, that provided a reason to tell these stories, because in my 30 years of true crime, my conclusion, it's not just my conclusion, but my conclusion has been that the people you least expect and most often trust
Hmm.
are the ones who usually do evil. Whether it's
Yes.
whether it's a priest who commits pedophilia, that violent betrayal of trust, or horrible betrayal of trust, or a Bernie Madoff. That's the subject of a new docu-series I'm doing.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, it's not wonderful he did what he did, but it's wonderful that you were going to tell the story through your lens.
But he was this avuncular, trusted fellow who
Yeah.
just, did ruined thousands of people's lives
And
because
the New York Mets.
exactly, because he was trusted. And so you can't give that lesson out to the younger generation enough. You can't overstate the lesson enough that just because somebody looks and acts a certain way, it doesn't make them trustworthy, because
Yeah.
we want to think that serial killers act evil all the time, that 24/7 they're dripping blood and looking evil, because it gives us this sense of security that, oh, I can spot a serial killer a mile away, so therefore I won't become a victim. No, it's just the opposite. Gacy was a well-liked person, well-connected, rubbed shoulders with Rosalind Carter on a local visit that she made to Chicago. Gacy was was a JC chaplain, for God's sake, and the life of the party, and his parties were the envy of the neighborhood, and Bundy too. I mean, the whole point of the Zac Efron movie was, it was seen through the perspective of his longtime live-in girlfriend, Liz Kendall, who thought he was an incredible person.
Right.
And so that's how serial killers operate. And I think it's important to put that lesson out there for a younger generation.
As a big professional wrestling fan, I've always found that the bad guys or the heels in real life are the nicest human beings you'll ever meet. It's always the opposite of what you think, which is what you were just saying.
Exactly. Yeah.
And will this Madoff project that you work on be through Netflix, or is that to be determined?
I can talk about it because it's one of the rare times we've actually announced the show early in its life, and yes, it'll be on Netflix. If you Google it, you'll see there's an announcement about it about 4 or 5 months ago.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to whatever is next from you, because the quality is always there, Joe.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the support.
Paltrocast.